Hello again and thank you for joining me. For today's beginner colour pencil project, we're going to colour this rose using 7 pencils. Now, if you are brand new to using colour pencils, I recommend you check out my 2 earlier tutorials where I show you how to apply the pencil to the paper and how to smoothly blend your colours together. Now, a lot of the time I've noticed that many beginner colour pencil artists are often a little bit shy when it comes to really covering their paper and getting some nice dark shadows into their work. So in today's piece, I want to encourage you to really be brave, and we're going to add some really nice dark solid areas to our piece. Now, this was the simplest rose that I could find to take a photo of in the florist, and I do think you should be able to have a go at drawing this one up for yourself. I do have a written step-by-step guide on how to draw up this shape over on my website, and $5 patrons can watch over my shoulder as I draw this in real time over on my Patreon page. Of course, if the idea of drawing the outlines doesn't thrill you, I will provide a line drawing for you to trace, along with a reference photo and some written instructions over on my website. I will have the pencils that I've used down in the description below. Today I'll be using my polychromos, but you can use any brand of pencils that you like. Today I'm going to be using the Arches Hot Press, which is my favourite paper at the moment, but that's a complete indulgence on my behalf. Any reasonably sturdy paper with a little bit of tooth to the surface will do the job very well. I will be blending this one out with some odorless mineral spirits and a very soft brush. Today this piece does have some really tight corners, so along with my normal soft brush I do have an extra small tip one just in case. So let's get started. Now, I've got my outlines all drawn up and they're a little darker than I would usually make them. I do want you to be able to see these outlines on the camera. You may notice that this little leaf has moved a little bit from my reference photo. In the picture it actually overlaps over the rose, but I've just moved it a little bit away so it's not complicating the picture any more than I have to make it. Now, in my first 2 tutorials, I sort of covered the base area first. Now, in this piece, I don't want to do that because I don't want to accidentally lose my outlines. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my rose and I'm going to look for the absolutely darkest areas, the areas that are in the deepest, darkest shadow, and I'm going to add a layer of my walnut brown. Now, with the Prismacolor pencils, they don't really have a really nice warm dark brown, so if I was using the Prismacolors, I'd be using the Tuscan red, which does the job as well. Okay, so I'm going to go into these darkest areas, and they are the areas mostly where the petals are casting a shadow on themselves. This is quite a dark red rose, so the shadows that are cast are going to be very dark to go along with that. This walnut brown is really going to help me get to that really nice, rich, dark shadow colour. That just gives me a nice base layer to work with, and it means I won't lose my edges as I work. Okay, so in my next step I'm going to use my lightest red, and I'm going to map out the lightest areas in my rose, just to give me a good idea where they are. Now, in this piece, I want to create a little bit of texture to these petals. There's a little bit of direction to the way they flow. So instead of going in tight little circles like I have in my previous pieces, I'm going to colour in the direction of that sort of texture. Any opportunity we can get to sort of add a little bit of texture to what would otherwise be a very solidly coloured piece really does make a difference. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. Now, this doesn't have to be anywhere near perfect. It's purely just an opportunity to map out those lights and darks. I now have a good idea where the brightest areas are and where the darkest areas are. And now that I've got that all mapped out, I'm going to use my darker red pencil to sort of colour in the remaining rows. I'm going to go straight over the top of that brown, which is going to mix into a really nice dark red colour. Once again, where there's texture, I'm going to follow the direction of that texture. You may notice that even though I'm using a very dark colour, I'm only still pressing very lightly. I'm going to build this up slowly. I'm holding the pencil quite a bit further away from the tip, just so I don't accidentally press too hard and start burnishing my paper. My next step will be to add the shadow that those outer petals cast onto that internal petal. Now there's a real curve to this shadow that really helps give that rose a nice rounded appearance. Okay, so it's time to blend this out for the first time. Now I'm going to use my brush, I'm going to dip it into my thinners, and then I'm going to dry it off quite thoroughly on a little piece of scrap paper. Now, in my first few tutorials, you'll notice that when I do the blending, I mostly sort of do this patting motion where I push it down into the paper, just slowly patting it down. But in this particular piece, we do have that texture, and I can use this opportunity to sort of, let me dry that off a bit, work in the direction of that texture. Just like I'm doing when I'm colouring in the direction of those petal veins, I'm once again taking another opportunity to turn an area of what appears to be a very solid colour and giving it just a little bit more life and interest. Okay, so there is a tiny little area here where I want to be a bit extra careful. If I accidentally push any of this red pigment onto the white areas of the paper, then I really stand no chance of removing it. So where I've got a tight spot, I'm going to use this little smaller brush, just so I don't go outside the area I want to go. If I do accidentally push any of that red pigment outside the area that I want, well, you know what? It's a rose. It could be any rose, and we might just draw that petal a little bit bigger or something. Nothing that can't be dealt with. Okay, so our first few layers are all blended out, and we've got our lights and our darks all mapped out on our piece. But she looks like an absolute mess. It's really scratchy, and we can still see lots of grainy texture in that paper, and we can still see a lot of white flecks through there. That's okay, because we're going to add layers and layers on top of this. This is just the groundwork. So we're going to allow those thinners to dry off the paper really, really thoroughly, and then we're going to come back and add some more layers to this piece. Okay, so it's been a good 10, maybe 15 minutes, and my thinners have dried off really nicely, and I'm going to start building up some of that colour saturation. I'm going to start by going back in with that walnut brown pencil and really building up those dark areas. I'm going to take the opportunity to overlap some of that shadow into this other petal, because it isn't entirely just this one that's in the shadow. As they curl in together, they cast a shadow on each other. So I'm going to take some of that walnut and bring it up the edge of this petal too. It's those hard edges that can take away the realism from some things. It sort of makes it look a little bit outlined. Whereas if we allow some of these edges to be lost together into those deeper shadows, it can really help add to that realistic effect. We can do the same thing for these internal petals, just allowing them to disappear down together into the shadows. Okay, so now I'm going to take my dark red colour and I'm really going to deepen these darker areas. And I'm just going to leave these very brightest areas for the last. I'm going to leave a little edge here so I can brighten that up with my lighter red. Okay, now I'm going to add a layer of my nice bright red over most of the piece and bring the whole thing together. I'm still only pressing lightly. It does look like a lot of pigment's going down, but it's just because it's starting to build up. I'm still only pressing lightly. I don't want to squash my paper. I'm going to leave a lighter area at the base here too. Okay, so now that I'm starting to get a really nice amount of pigment on my paper, I'm going to blend this out once more. Now, this time, like I showed you in my first tutorial, I have to make sure that I'm really starting to take most of the thinners off that brush. Otherwise, I'm going to start lifting the colour back off the paper, and I really don't want to have to do that. So I'm going to go in, once again, working in the direction of the texture on those petals. Okay, so you can see how much stronger that colour is and how much more completely that pencil is covering the paper compared to the first time I blended that out. But I feel like we can go even further with this. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do with this next layer of pencils is add a little touch of pink to the base of this rose. Now, if you look at the reference picture, you may be able to see that there's a little area just at the base there that's a much brighter, more pinkish purpley tone of red. Now, when you're working trying to make something really realistic, it's those little shifts of colour that can make all of the difference. And if I was working to make this really realistic, I'd probably add a few warm reds up here, maybe add some blue tones or some reflected light. All of those really subtle little colour changes can make a really big difference. Now, of course, we're trying to keep this piece fairly simple, but if you'd like to add just that little bit of shifted colour at the base, then it can make a big difference to the overall look. Okay, with that little touch out of the way, I think it's finally time to go in with the big guns and start getting a little bit of black into this piece. Now, I'm going to be very careful and only place this black down in the very, very darkest areas of this rose. Being very careful not to add too much, just allowing it to create that really strong contrast that makes the whole piece more interesting to look at. Okay, so you may be wondering why I didn't just use that black colour to shade with to start with. Well, I'll show you why. Okay, so what we have here is a really rough gradient using the colours that I'm using today. Now, in the top example, I have just used my black pencil and shaded into my red. And while it's not as obvious on camera, I can see that there's an area here where it has really sucked all of the life and the warmth out of that red as they've blended together. Now, in the bottom example, I have used a nice warm dark walnut brown as a bit of a bridge between my black and my red. And by doing so, I have been able to maintain a nice warm colour to my red without deadening it as instantly as I did with the black. Now, black is a really dominating colour, and it can suck the life out of a drawing really quickly if not used carefully. And a lot of artists refuse to use it for that very reason. But I think it can be used to wonderful effect if you are very careful, adding it only to the very darkest areas of your drawing for the best effect. Now, you may notice that even at the darkest end of this gradient, I still have a touch of red blended in with that black. As well as deadening colours, black on its own can look really flat and blah. So I always like to add a little touch of colour to it, and that small amount of colour just keeps the life in that black and can actually make it look even darker than it would on its own. Okay, so back to my rose, and now that I've got my black established in there, I'm going to go back in with my nice walnut brown and blend it back in. Then I'm going to go in over with my darkest red again. And then one more time with my lightest red. And I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to blend him out one last time. Okay, while I'm waiting for my rose to dry, I'm going to add a layer of my lightest green over the entire area of the leaves. Once again, colouring in the direction of any texture in the leaves just to add a little bit of effect. Then I'm going to go over the shaded areas with my darker green pencil. And as a final touch of shading, I can add just a little bit of my walnut brown or my Tuscan red if I'm using the prismacolor down under the very darkest shadow of this leaf. When I feel like I've got enough of that green pencil down on the page, I'm going to blend it all out using that little tiny paintbrush so I can get into all those fine details. Okay, now that my thinners have dried, I'm going to go back over those leaves just to make sure that they have the same depth of colour as the rest of the rose. Once again, just going over with that light green and then darkening the shadows with the darker colours. And while I'm here, I might take a moment just to darken up the base of that rose where it comes into contact with those leaves. There's a little bit of a shadow there that I've missed. At this point of the drawing, I'm really having a good look at my piece, looking for any of those small little details that I may have missed as I worked earlier. And then I'm going to blend this out one more time. Okay, so our rose is nearly done, and we've got some really nice saturated colour on our paper. So I'm just going to take a moment to add some final little details. I'm going to use my dark red pencil to add in a few of those little veins that are in those leaves that we've sort of followed all along. Just to add that last little detail. I'm also going to use this red pencil to just add a tiny little touch of red to the tip of these leaves. And I'm going to use my very dark green pencil to just add a few little spikes and a few little details to these leaves. And with those final details, I think I'm ready to call this one done. I really hope you give this a go. If you do, I would love to see your finished work. Feel free to tag me on Facebook and Instagram and show me how you went. I would like to take a moment to thank my lovely patrons for supporting me. You guys help make these tutorials possible. I hope you found this useful. Please leave me a like or a comment to tell me what you think, and if you'd like to see more, why not hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, guys.